Hello everybody, welcome back to my next, a little bit more advanced baking video. Now the cake I'm making today, if anything says Saxon cake, Saxony in Germany that is, if anything says Saxon cake, it would be this one. It's called Sächsische Eierschecke. Now even try to use that word in other parts of Germany, especially you know, in some northern or western or southern parts, and they might, but they probably don't know what you're talking about, because it is really quintessential Saxon kind of cake, and it's made with it's kind of a layer cake. It's a baked cake, and my grandmother, you know, I remember her making this, and there is a part in it, we get to that later, when the egg whites have to be beaten by hand, and I can still see her with the whisk and going hard. You wouldn't believe it. I couldn't do that. My arms just won't have any of it. So, Sächsische Eierschecke. So there is no translation in German, and there is definitely no translation into English. You just have to go with it. It's I think the most loose translation I could give you is it's like a baked egg fluff quark cake. It's yeah, you'll see when it's done. Anyway, so you will need, first of all, check out one of my other videos about a yeast dough. That's on YouTube, so you can check it out, how to make one of those, because, you know, otherwise this video is just going to go on forever. So I've made one of those actually yesterday in preparation, and it was sitting overnight and nicely risen, and I halved it, so half of it is in the freezer. And I've already lined my round baking tin with the base. That's the yeast dough base. And you know, sort of I put some margarine on the side of the baking tin, grease the tin, and you can use baking powder paper, it's up to you. Put that one in, and so that's the bottom layer, right? So now the next layer is, again, my favorite ingredient in baking is quark. I've talked about this a couple of times already. So quark being essentially a type of fresh cheese or solid sour milk, whatever you want to call it. And we're lucky here where we live. We have a cheese factory that's, you know, as the crow flies, about 10 kilometers from here, but you have to cross the harbor, and they actually make it. And they only have one type of quark. If you're in Germany, or you travel through Germany, and you go into any supermarket, it's cheap as chips, and you get different fat levels. So I normally use the one with the lowest fat level, but here we only get one. I used to make this myself with raw milk, so highly recommend it actually. So we need 500 grams of quark, right? So that's this. 150 sugar, that's already in here. A pinch of salt, 3 whole eggs, and 1 pack of vanilla pudding, or alternatively, about 40 grams of your custard powder that you wherever you are, that you can buy. I get these from Germany. See, they're like this. I've talked about those before as well. But I also bought these ones here in New Zealand in a European specialty shop. So it's basically, it's like a thick custard, like a solid custard rather than a runny one. So if you use your general custard powder, you probably need a little bit more than you would normally use otherwise for your thick sort of runny custard. And that's really it. Now, my grandmother always taught me, so this one, and there's a sieve and a bowl. So what I'll do is I kind of press this through the sieve, so it makes the quark a bit kind of fluffier, nicer. And it makes it easier to, you know, mix the other ingredients so it's not lumpy. Right, so this is really all you do. You kind of move it. You can use a normal spoon if you like. It's really up to you. To put this Quark. So basically, you can see that that's what it looks like. Yeah, like little spaghetti kind of thing. Right. So all 500 grams need to go through this. That's all that. Let's get rid of this. Right, so there you go. So that's your quark, right? So now we're adding on to that the sugar, and there's a pinch of salt in here too. And I haven't mentioned that earlier. I make my own vanilla sugar. So I just use some vanilla beans and pop them in a big jar with just sugar and let them sit for a couple of weeks, and they will take on the flavor of the vanilla. And it goes a long way. So I just put about a tablespoon of that in as well. If you don't want to do this, or haven't got the time, or don't want to buy it, you're more than welcome to use just vanilla paste. And just use maybe half a sort of teaspoon, because that goes a long way, just for the extra vanilla flavor. And then you put in your 3 eggs, cracking them in the cup first. I mean, these days it's very rare to find a bad egg, but best to be safe, right? So this is not a cake for anybody on any diet, trust me. There is a lot of stuff in here, but mind you, most cakes aren't really. Right, and then comes my pack of vanilla pudding, or if you use custard powder. And then you mix all of this until it's nice and smooth. Now this is my grandmother's recipe, so there are, I think every family in Saxony might have their own recipe, and every bakery has their own. There's some who put an extra bit of starch in this kind of mixture to make it sort of, or they put in semolina or something like that, but this is the way my grandmother always used to make it, and so that's the way I make it. That's why we call it Irmgard's kitchen. Right, so the next step, so as I mentioned, this is already done, so we put this quark mixture on the yeast base. So that's our second layer. Tell you what, if those videos had smell as well as looks, this smells really nice because of the vanilla. There's always someone who can lick the bowl afterwards, usually the one who's manning the video camera, or the cat. Right, so even it out nicely. Doesn't need to be exact. I mean, this is home baking, not shop baking really. And having a couple of, there you go. That's number 2 done. Now, some people, back to that, you know, every family's got their own recipe. Some people put some almonds on it, or some hazelnuts, you know, chopped kind of things. In my family, we put raisins on it. Just a couple, you know, just a sort of, I don't know. Or you can use currants, or chopped plums, or prunes, you know, any other fruit. We used a similar kind of cake mixture also for rhubarb cake, by the way. I might make that when the rhubarb is in season, and make one for you guys here. So that's number 2 layer done. Now we're getting to the way more complicated, for some people, third layer. So that involves first cooking some custard, or pudding rather. So I'm gonna just cook one of these now, and again I use one of these packs and follow the instructions on the pack, and that's 500 milliliter of milk and 40 grams of sugar for one pack. Now if you're using custard powder, I really encourage you to use a little bit more than what you would normally use for 500 milliliters of milk, just so it sets a little bit thicker, because that's part of the setting process. So I'll do that now, and then I'll see you when I do the next stages of this. There. So the second stage of, like we've already made this, right? And so I've cooked the pudding, and I've transferred it from my pot into this bowl. It's still piping hot, and so that's 500 milliliter milk with the pudding. And now I'm adding to this 150 grams of butter while this is still hot, right? And kind of mix it until the butter dissolves. Of course, if you wanna, that's what I mean when I said it's a very rich kind of cake. If you soften the butter first, that makes that process a lot easier, trust me. Or you can just, I had it a bit too big, that piece. Cut it apart so it dissolves quicker in the hot pudding. Right? There you go. Just keep stirring it until that butter is dissolved, and the pudding will change color as a result as well. It sort of will sort of look like a bit of a translucent kind of thing. And while you're doing that, now what I've done is I've separated 5 eggs. So I've got the egg yolks in a cup, and I've got the egg whites in my mixer. And so now I'm just going to mix these until they, stiff and have nice soft peaks, right? So start off a bit slow, just to get it going. There you go. Just crank it up. Sorry about the noise. Right, so that's your butter pudding mixture. Now to that you add the egg yolks, and sugar. 200 grams of sugar and a pinch of salt. Getting there. There you go. I don't know if you can see this, but you can see how the egg white is sort of a nice sort of peak. For those Australian New Zealanders, that's kind of the same consistency that you want for your pavlova. That's the kind of thing. So, hang on, I need to get another spoon. Take this off. Right. You've got to make sure that you separated those eggs, those yolks from the whites really cleanly. If you have any bit of egg yolk in here, this process won't work. Now I'm guessing you made cakes before, so that's how you ended up here, but that's one of those little things that I learned fairly early on. And now what we do is, so what happened was, so we put the butter in quite cold, and so that lowered the temperature of the pudding, So by the time I put the egg yolks in, they didn't cook, you know, so it would sort of split kind of thing. So we've mixed all that, and that's kind of, it's a bit of a translucent kind of consistency. So now I'm adding the stiff egg white onto it. Right. Meanwhile, my oven is preheating at 150 degrees. And so what I do now is I just gently, at this stage, move the egg white under the pudding mixture. You don't want to do this too fast, because then you end up with a solid mess. You want to have the air that is in the egg whites still in this. See how that sort of mixes nicely. And that's that part, this here, that's the German or the Saxon word Schecke. That's where that name comes from. So there are many cakes who have Schecke on top. I can't even translate that in German, I can't even tell you. And Eierschecke, so the first word Eier, eggs, because there's so many eggs in this cake. Right? So there you go. So you added the volume. Right. Show you. There you go. Oh, well, it's got to go on there anyway. So there you go. And then we add it onto our cake. Like so. Spoon, get all this goodness out of the bowl. Right, so now the oven is preheating. Put it in the oven, middle rack, depending on your oven. I put it in for about 3/4 of an hour at 150 to 160 degree on fan heat. Now if you have a different oven setting, you may have to change this. The important thing is, do not sort of open the oven a lot of times and check on it. Just check on it when you think it might be done, because that might collapse the whole thing, almost like a souffle kind of thing. So that goes in the oven now, and it's a pretty thick cake. Right, so my cake is in the oven. Just to recapture, so the recipe, so the bottom is a yeast dough. You probably could do a different base if you're more comfortable with something that's made with baking powder, up to you. And then the second layer is the quark. And so 500 grams of quark, 150 sugar, a pinch of salt, 3 eggs, and the vanilla pudding or vanilla custard. Right? And the third layer, the Schecke part of it, that's the most complicated thing at the end. So that's a 500 to 550 ml of milk and whatever custard equivalent you need. So if your, let's say your Edmonds custard powder says for 500 milliliters of milk you need 4 tablespoons, then maybe do 4.5, make it a little bit thicker, or even 5. And then you need to cook that, and then into that hot custard goes 150 grams of butter, 200 grams of sugar, a pinch of salt, 5 egg yolks that you previously separated nice and cleanly. And the egg whites you beat either by hand or in one of these, or one of those hand mixers until you have nice stiff peaks. And then lastly, you mix that egg white slowly under the still warm pudding mixture, and that goes onto your quark. And then you bake it. Now, it's a lower temperature than some other cakes, simply because that quark mixture needs a little bit longer before it's properly cooked and set. So you want this to sort of more of a slow baking kind of cake. And then you can use one of those, skewers, wooden skewers. When you think, oh, it's nice and brown on top, it's probably done. Just use one of those and poke it in, and if it comes out cleanly and not wet, then your cake is done. And then turn your oven off, open it a little bit, and leave it in there to cool down. Don't move it. Leave it in there to cool down, otherwise it might collapse. And I pop a photo of the final results at the end. Happy baking, everybody, and thank you again for watching these videos. Right, so there's my Eierschecke in the oven, and if you can see that, it's cracking at the top, and it's risen quite a bit above the baking tin. It will, once we move it, or once I turn it off, it will sort of flatten down again, so it will, be just below that. It's almost ready, and this cracking up at the top is quite normal. So just to show you what I mean, so I've got a, like a bamboo skewer, and I just poked it into one of those cracked bits, and right in the middle, and just take it down, and see how this is still quite wet. Right, hard to see on this phone camera. Anyway, so that's obviously not quite done, even though it is nice and brown already in some areas. But just give it a couple more minutes.